Steward ABN International, a digital conference spanning 2 weeks, featuring over 40 selected Bible speakers, teachers, and pastors from around the world in over 10 languages of the 1040 window.
In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul said, if Christ was not raised from the dead, our preaching is useless and so is your faith. Christianity is not like the overwhelming majority of other religions. In the overwhelming majority of other religions, you believe in them simply because you've had some sort of a subjective personal experience that makes you think that it's true. Christianity actually bases its truth or falsehood on a verifiable act of history, namely, the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. The resurrection is a fact of history, and I'm talking to you about this today because I want to help solidify your confidence in Jesus. That Christianity is not just a nice idea, that in fact Christianity, that no argument stands against historic Christianity because historic Christianity is in fact true. It's the actual state of affairs of the universe. It's the way the universe is in fact organized. And that you can have confidence, and I'm preaching today on this topic, I'm talking on this topic, an apologetic message really, so that you can have confidence that Christianity is in fact exactly what we have been preaching that it is. I'm going to surprise you with a thought. Most scholars, and by scholars I mean academics who have spent a lot of time studying the evidence for the truth of Jesus' resurrection, most scholars, even skeptical scholars and atheist scholars, have come to certain conclusions about various aspects of the resurrection events. And I think this will surprise you that the overwhelming majority, the majority of scholars, the majority of academics believe the following things, even if they're, like I say, skeptics or atheists. The majority of skeptics or atheists, in addition, obviously, to Christian scholars, believe that Jesus did die of Roman crucifixion. You'll get occasionally the scholar that's out here or there that's arguing the case, but really that's not the majority view, even among skeptics. That Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. The majority of scholars believe that Jesus was buried. The majority of scholars believe that then Jesus' tomb was found empty. The majority of scholars believes that the disciples had experiences that they claimed were appearances of the risen Jesus. And the majority of scholars believe that the disciples were willing to suffer, endure great suffering, and even some of them give their lives for this conviction that Jesus really was raised from the dead. And I'm going to take these points one by one with you. And I'm sure some of you are already like, what, the majority? That's true. And let me make one more suggestion. If you go to my blog, and I feel a little awkward about this, but if you go to my blog, clayjones.net, you can find a lot of this information there. If you click on the resurrection tab, there's a resurrection topic. Click on that one. There's also a sex topic, but don't click on that one. That won't help you with this topic. Oh, well. The New Testament has been accurately transmitted to this day. You see, scholars have what we call the bibliographical test, and some of you have heard about this. The bibliographical test examines the date between the autograph. Now, the autograph is when the document was actually first penned. When Paul put pen to paper, or Matthew or Mark, or, put pen to paper, that's when it was, we call that the autograph. We take the bibliographical test examines the date from the autograph, when it was actually penned, to our earliest extant manuscript. And extant, by that we just mean the earliest still existing manuscript. And then we compare that, we examine the total number of manuscripts to support whether or not this has been accurately transmitted. And when scholars look at the New Testament, when historians look at it, I should say, they're not so much looking at it as, they don't look at it as a book. They don't look at the New Testament as a book. They look at it as a collection of 27 different books written by different authors. And so each of these are bearing a testimony and are telling us things about the truth. Now, when it comes to the bibliographical test, the New Testament surpasses every ancient document. In fact, I've come up with a chart for you here. Hopefully that'll happen. But for instance, if you look at Homer's Iliad, that was written in around 800 BC. Our earliest extant copy, a manuscript copy of it, any kind of fragment or anything to back it up, is from 400 BC. In other words, there's a 400-year gap from when Homer's Iliad was penned to our earliest extant manuscript. And of Homer's Iliad, people actually count these things very carefully. At least the last time they did a careful cataloging of them, there was 1,757 manuscripts of Homer's Iliad. Now, I've actually written an article on this, published an article on the documents and how they compare with each other. Because of the time's sake here, obviously I don't have time for that. Just give you one more example. Plato's tetralogies, and in the tetralogies, the Plato's Republic and other famous works of his are in the tetralogies. They were penned about 400 BC. Our earliest extant manuscript fragment is from 895 AD. That's a 1,300-year gap from when it was originally penned to our earliest manuscripts to support what it actually said. Now, when it comes to the New Testament was penned between 50 and 100 AD, and our earliest extant manuscript is from 130. In fact, a lot of people think it's from about 115, 16, 17 AD, but that's only a 40-year gap from when it was originally penned to when we start having manuscript attestation to it, extant manuscripts, you understand. And we have about 5,795, the number's always increasing, but we have about 5,795 manuscripts. Now, what we like to point out to the skeptics, and what skeptics often, in fact, are willing to acknowledge, as you'll see in a minute, if you're going to accept that other ancient documents of antiquity have been accurately transmitted to us today, well, then you need to accept the transmission of the New Testament being accurate, because guess what? We have the gap between when it was originally penned to when we start having manuscripts to support it, and the tremendous amount of manuscript attestation that we have, almost 6,000, it just dwarfs it. In fact, I put this in a bar chart to compare this. The red bar is the New Testament. This is just Greek manuscripts. And then the brown is Homer, the manuscripts we have at Homer, 1757. And then in the orange, I'm including all of the manuscripts we have for Herodotus, Sophocles, Plato, Caesar, Tacitus, Pliny the Elder, Thucydides, and Demosthenes. All of those combined don't even reach what Homer has. In other words, Homer, there's a lot of manuscripts of Homer, but look at that compared to the New Testament. But this doesn't even include the amount of manuscripts that were translated into other languages. In fact, there's over 18,000 manuscripts that were translated into other languages. It's just the attestation for this is amazing. In fact, Bart Ehrman, who is a skeptic, wrote with Bruce Metzger, pointed out, he says, besides the textual evidence derived from the New Testament Greek manuscripts and from early versions, the textual critic has available the numerous scriptural quotations included in commentary, sermons, and other treatises written by the early church fathers. Indeed, so extensive are these citations that if all the other sources of our knowledge of the text of the New Testament were destroyed, they would be sufficient alone for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament. So you're in the position, you can either say we can't know anything about history at all, which of course is a very ignorant and stupid thing to do, or you can say, you have to say, well, if we're going to trust other manuscripts, then we need to trust the New Testament. Anthony Flew, atheist, when he was an atheist, said this. He said, there's much greater richness of manuscripts for all of the major early Christian documents than there is for, say, the plays of Aeschylus or Sophocles or the works of Aristotle. Of course, that's not evidence about Jesus, but very good authority for the accuracy of the text that is printed in the translation of the New Testament. So there you have an atheist going, yes, of course, the New Testament was accurately transmitted to us. And I could go on and on about this, but there isn't time. Just, you'll have to take my word for it, or you can, like I say, go to my blog and look at more of this and find that indeed it is true that the overwhelming majority of skeptics agrees that the New Testament was accurately transmitted. So now I get into the actual resurrection information. Jesus was crucified. Of course, all four Gospels include this, but it isn't just the Bible. Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews, said this, and this is, now he's a Jewish historian, he's not a Christian, writing from about 93 to 94 AD, in other words, in the first century of Christianity. He says, there was a wise man who was called Jesus. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and die, and those who become his disciples did not abandon their loyalty to him. Tacitus, a Roman historian, in his annals, written about 109 AD, so very close to, when Christianity was founded, he says, consequently, to get rid of the report, and the report they're talking about is Nero setting fire to Rome. Nero, who reigned from 54 to 68, fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So here you see him saying that Christ suffered the extreme penalty, and no one doubted, everyone knew what the extreme penalty was in the Roman Empire, and that was crucifixion. In fact, the 2nd century satirist Lucian wrote, the Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. Now, you will run into people saying, and occasionally a scholar will say something like this, but, Jesus didn't even really exist. I've got to be honest with you, and I have a blog entitled, Jesus Never Existed, ? That's dumb! ! I gave it a very academic title. It's just simply not true. The overwhelming majority of scholars, even skeptical and atheist scholars, believe that Jesus was a real person. And not only that, they believe that Jesus really was crucified. In fact, consider in John Dominic Crossan, the co-founder of the Jesus Seminar, who was, by the way, a tremendous critic of historic Christianity, said, and I quote, I take it absolutely for granted that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Security about the fact of the crucifixion derives not only from the unlikelihood that the Christians would have invented the story, right? You wouldn't make it up. If you're going to just invent Christianity out of whole cloth, you wouldn't invent that Jesus was crucified by the Romans, right? You wouldn't make it that way. The unlikelihood the Christians would have invented it, but also from the existence of two early and independent non-Christian witnesses, a Jewish one talking about Josephus, which I just read to you, and a Roman one from the 110s or 120 CE. Notice he says, I take it it's absolutely for granted. Of course Jesus was crucified. In fact, Gerd Ludemann in 1995 wrote, it is certain that Jesus was crucified around the year 30. He says it is certain that Jesus was crucified around the year 30. This isn't open for debate. Like I say, academics don't think this. Now, the village skeptic or the village atheist will go, nuh-uh. But people that have studied it, even if they're skeptical or atheist scholars, agree that this is true, that Jesus was crucified. Not only that, the overwhelming majority of them believe that Jesus died. Of course, it makes sense that he died. He was crucified. Then they scourged him. You remember the story. They scourged him. Then they did what? They made Jesus carry his crossbar. And many of you know, he was too weakened to carry his crossbar from the scourging that he just endured. Then, of course, crucifixion involved driving spikes in the wrists and spikes through the feet. And by the way, you couldn't exhale hanging from the cross like this. You couldn't exhale. And so what you had to do is you had to keep raising yourself up to breathe. And so we read in John 19:31, since it was the day of preparation, and so the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus, they saw he was already dead. They did not break his legs, but one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and out came blood and water, showing that the pericardium had been burst. And John even recording this kind of going, recording this is kind of, wow, blood and water gushed out of his side. That would be unusual. You'd think there was only blood, but this is a sign that medical people have made a big point of, that he would recognize this. So Jesus, when we say Jesus died, of course, the soldiers knew what they were doing. And they thrust the spear in his side. And if you thrust a spear in somebody's side, really into their side, even if you did it a little bit actually, but if you really thrust it into their side and they don't move, they're probably dead. there is no testimony to a wounded Jesus. There's no counter story. Do you know what I mean by that? In other words, historically, nobody came up with a counter story that Jesus really wasn't dead. Sometimes you'll have people say, oh, well, he didn't really die on the cross. He just passed out. In fact, Ahmadi Muslims believe that. But that doesn't make any sense. Think about this just for a minute. Have you ever stepped on a piece of glass? Actually, I ask my students this, and sometimes I'll go, no, I never have. And I'll go like, what? How? You've never broken glass? And I mean, maybe we just don't vacuum carefully enough. But I'll always find that one little piece of glass that was missing. And when you've stepped on a piece of glass, I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm like hopping, keeping that foot off the ground, right? And hopping around. Imagine if Jesus really had spikes driven into his wrists, spikes driven into his feet, and he survived the crucifixion. And how does he get over to where the apostles are? He crawls. He can't walk. I mean, for crying out loud, like I say, if you've ever had a piece of glass in the bottom of your foot, you go, whoa, I'm going to keep, how does he get over there on his, elbows like this and kind of crawls, and he gets to the door and he kind of knocks, and they open the door and they say, the Lord of life, who's triumphed over the grave, is here. No. Nobody would go out preaching that Jesus Christ had been raised from the dead and that he was the Lord of life and that they could face tremendous torture and persecution themselves if Jesus had appeared to them wounded and broken and they put him in a bed somewhere from where he finally died. Nobody would proclaim that Jesus was raised from the dead in that situation. I mentioned the breathing because, as the Journal of the American Medical Association points out when it comes to crucifixion, it says the major physiologic effect of crucifixion was interference with normal respiration. In other words, you couldn't breathe. So to breathe, you had to keep raising yourself up on the cross, and then you were pivoting on the spikes in your wrists and putting pressure on your feet. This was a horrifically torturous way to die, you can imagine. And you had to keep doing this nonstop just to keep breathing. So when someone was no longer moving, they were dead. The Romans had no question about this. And that's why, by the way, when the Jews, I read you the passage, when the Jews said, we need to speed this up, it's the Sabbath. And so they went and broke the legs of the other two. Why? Because if your legs were broken, it hastened death because you could no longer push yourself up to breathe. Excruciating, by the way, when we use the word excruciating, it comes from the Latin excrucis, for out of the cross. Gerd Ludemann says about this, in fact, atheist Gerd Ludemann says, the fact of Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. This is what an academic atheist says. It's indisputable. Of course, in Gerd Ludemann's mind, of course, Jesus died of crucifixion. Duh, stop it. So Jesus died, Jesus was crucified, Jesus died, then Jesus was buried. And so we read in Mark 15:43 that Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, he was a member of the Sanhedrin, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised to hear that he should already have died, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was dead, and when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. Now, it's interesting that all four Gospels, and even the Gospel of Peter, which we don't recognize as inspired, but it in this case serves as a text that substantiates the truth of it, all of them mention Joseph of Arimathea. Now, the reason I bring that up is you could not make up a name of someone like Joseph of Arimathea. There's only 70 people on the Sanhedrin. It would be like if I made up and said, I was talking to U.S. Senator Mervyn Snurd the other day, and you go, there's no Mervyn Snurd on the U.S. Senate. I would know because that's a weird name, and I'd know that. You couldn't invent a name and say he's on the Sanhedrin. You couldn't do that. It just wouldn't be true. In fact, skeptic Jeffrey J. Lauder, again, not a Christian, in fact, a critic of Christianity, says, therefore, the burial of Jesus by Joseph of Arimathea has a high final probability. It's very likely that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. So Jesus was crucified, Jesus died, Jesus was buried, and then Jesus' tomb was found empty. In Luke chapter 24, verse 1, it says, on the first day of the week, that very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb, and they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they entered, they did not find the body of Jesus. You remember the story. I'm going to speed this up by just simply saying, and finally they encounter Jesus and see, and they realize Jesus is raised from the dead. They go and tell the disciples, the Lord has risen. Now, all of the Gospels make a point of recording that the women were first. This is actually a very helpful thing to us Christians today. It wasn't necessarily helpful in the first 3 centuries of Christianity, but it's very helpful in the centuries now. Why? Because if you were going to make the resurrection story up, you would never, ever, ever, ever have women be the first at the tomb and be the first to start proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus. Not a chance would you make that up. Skeptics acknowledge this. In fact, they call it the principle of embarrassment, that you wouldn't write something embarrassing like that unless it were true. And why did they feel this way? The Jewish Mishnah back then put it this way. The following are considered incompetent to be witnesses: gamblers with dice, usurers, pigeon breeders, those who deal with produce on the Sabbatic year, and slaves. This is the rule. All evidence that cannot be received from a woman cannot be received from any of the above. But notice how the Lord, in his, of course, omniscient wisdom, he has women discovered first. You just wouldn't make it up that way. And so it says in Matthew 28:11, and while they were going, behold, some of the guard went to the city and told the chief priests what had taken place. And when they assembled the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, tell people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So they took the money and did as they were directed, and the story has been spread among the Jews to this day. In fact, we happen to know that this was in the Jewish Talmud. The story is that Jesus' body was stolen. That's the story in the Talmud. Not only that, but Justin, we call him Justin Martyr. That Martyr wasn't actually his last name. It was because he was martyred in AD 165 for being a Christian. But before he was martyred, he wrote to Trypho the Jew. He said, you have chosen and ordained men throughout the world to proclaim that a godless and lawless heresy has sprung up from one Jesus, a Galilean deceiver, whom we crucified. But his disciples stole him away by night from the tomb, where he was laid when unfastened from the cross, and now deceive men by asserting that he has risen from the dead and ascended into heaven. Notice Justin Martyr writes, he says, Trypho, you're going out and telling people that we stole the body. Now, why is this body stolen thing important when we talk about the empty tomb? Because with all this testimony, like I say, the Talmud, Justin writing and saying, hey, stop telling people that we stole the body. The Bible account itself, what does it acknowledge? The tomb was empty. That's a hugely significant point. In fact, skeptic Michael Grant, again, not a Christian, writes, he says, if we apply the same sort of criteria that we would apply to any other ancient literary sources, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty. The early church would never concocted on its own account the statement that this most solemn and faithful of all discovery was made by women. You would not have made it up that way. Now that's a lot. So what have we seen so far? Most scholars, even skeptical and atheist scholars, agree Jesus died, Jesus was crucified, Jesus was buried, and Jesus' tomb was found empty. And they also agree with this, that Jesus' resurrection was soon proclaimed by the first disciples. If we come to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and by the way, it's very interesting to me. I don't know any atheists that don't agree, that have studied atheists. Like I say, you have village atheists, and those are different. I mean, the guy that's just kind of like, that's not true. I know that's not true. But I mean, those who've really studied it, they agree. Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 15, and on my blog, you could see atheists in one of my blogs. Atheists were just swirling around this, and I said, do you agree that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians? All of them. Yeah, we all agree. Yes, he wrote 1 Corinthians. Okay. This is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. Oh, I should add, almost everyone agrees that 1 Corinthians was written in the 50s. Now, when I say 50, 53, 54, 55 AD, well, when was Jesus crucified? Somewhere in the early 30s. That's only like 23, 4 years after Jesus was crucified. Paul writes this, for I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. Now notice this, most scholars consider this to be like a creedal statement. He says, what I delivered What I delivered to you, I received. In other words, I got this from others. And here's the statement, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scripture, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scripture. And now listen, he goes on, this is very important to them, that he appeared to Cephas, that it would be Peter, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive. What's the point on most of whom are still alive? You can go ask them if you want to. They're still alive. Go check it out. They're still here. Though some have fallen asleep, he says some of them have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as one untimely born, he appeared to me. So think about the significance of this. I mean, Paul is recounting all of the sightings. Of course, in the Gospels, you have them also recording, Jesus appeared to me. What do the scholars say about this? Atheist Gerd Ludemann says, it is certain, think about it, it's certain that something must have happened after Jesus' death, which led the followers to speak of Jesus as the risen Christ. Something had to happen. I mean, Jesus is crucified, and the disciples scatter, right? They run for the hills, they start hiding, and then all of a sudden they say, hey, Jesus, they start proclaiming Jesus' resurrection in a community that had just tortured Jesus to death. They start boldly proclaiming it. They say, anybody that looks at this, even a skeptic, has to go, well, like Gerd Ludemann, it's certain that something had to happen. Something made them do this. In fact, Ludemann says in another place, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Atheist Michael Martin, and I emphasize he's an atheist. His book is entitled The Case Against Christianity, but he says it is correct that the resurrection was proclaimed by the early Christians. Bart Ehrman, who used to be a Christian but is no longer, he's now a skeptic and a critic of Christianity, but listen to what he admits to. Historians, of course, have no difficulty whatsoever speaking about the belief in Jesus' resurrection. It's not a problem to them, since it is a matter of public record. For it is listen to these words, it is a historical fact that some of Jesus' followers came to believe that he'd been risen from the dead soon after his execution. Ehrman, not a Christian, says, it's a historical fact. This isn't up for grabs. Of course he did. So what do we have? We have that Jesus was crucified, died, buried, his tomb was found empty, the resurrection was soon proclaimed by the first Christians, and then Jesus' disciples suffered and sometimes died for their belief that he was raised from the dead. All of the disciples, of course, suffered. Some of them actually even gave their lives because, of course, the Jews at the time didn't take too kindly to them going about and proclaiming that the guy that they killed was really the Messiah. And soon the Romans started killing Christians too, and many of the first disciples died for that belief, as was the case of Jesus' brother James. And listen to this. This is Josephus, again, a non-Christian Jewish source, written about 93, 94. It says, Festus now dead, and Albinus was on the road, so he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. And indeed, James was stoned to death. Now, how much evidence, think about this. James thought his brother, if you read the Gospels, he thought Jesus was a little whacked early on. I mean, he thought, I think he's whacked. Didn't use that word. He didn't use the whacked word, but you get the point. He thought he was a little bit confused. But all of a sudden, not only does James become a leader of the Christian church, but he's willing to be stoned to death for his proclamation that Jesus was in fact raised from the dead. For his belief that Jesus was raised from the dead, he was willing to be stoned again to death. And I ask you, how much evidence would it take for you to so believe that your brother was God that you'd be willing to die for that fact? That'd take probably quite a bit, wouldn't it? Well, okay, you can kill me. My brother's God. Most of you, might have trouble thinking that your brother's a good guy even, much less God. But so that's a lot of evidence. In fact, Eusebius, church historian in 330, he died in 339, so probably in the 330s, early 330s, he wrote in his history, "It is therefore recorded that Paul was beheaded in Rome itself, and that Peter likewise was crucified under Nero. This account of Peter and Paul is substantiated by the fact that their names are preserved in the cemeteries of that place, even to this present day." Now think about that again, the significance of that. He says, look, Peter and Paul were executed by Nero. You can go to the cemetery at Rome and check it out for yourself. Go do it. That's a significant thing. And how, by the way, how do you get, if, people go, oh, it was a conspiracy. How do you get Paul, who's killing Christians, to join you? Hey, Paul, you want to join us? Don't kill me, don't kill me, don't kill me. But why don't you join me in deceiving your fellow Jews, and we can put on an elaborate hoax. Yes, it'll probably end in our deaths. But why don't you join us in this elaborate hoax, and we'll try to deceive the Jewish nation that you love and say you support? That's not going to, does that really work? How do you get James to become a Christian, really, other than the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead? Now, some of you have been going, I don't get it. So you're saying, skeptics agree that Jesus died on the cross, that he was buried, his tomb was found empty, that the disciples immediately began to proclaim the risen Lord and so on. But they're still skeptics, right? Yeah, well, they have given themselves a way out. And this is a little bit of a long statement, but it's so well put. It kind of sums it all up. It's by skeptic Keith Parsons. And listen to what